Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis. Continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. You know, it's getting towards festival season. I'm already getting excited. I got a couple of things I'm going to. Going to a secret festival in the Bay Area. I can't talk about that, but maybe one of these days we can. Then I'm going to go to Zora, which is an event in Hungary, which I have friends who've gone. Everybody loves it. They have a great time, and they have a really devoted speaker zone. And, you know, that's something that I've been enjoying at festivals since the early 2000s, when the festival culture started to sprout these kind of speaker places or places where workshops would happen. And, you know, up to that point, it really didn't happen very, very often. And it became kind of part of a whole scene, and really enjoyed that. And one of the places that, one of the festivals where I was enjoying that back in the day was at Boom, which I visited in 2002 as a speaker. So, you know, I got to get a nice transatlantic flight out of the deal and show up at this, you know, what has become one of the most stalwart festival events on the planet. You know, every other year they've been doing a crack job experimenting with the form of the festival, you know, winding up purchasing the property where it takes place. I mean, it's a wonderful site, lots of different kind of music, you know, different folks. It's interesting. There's some differences between festivals in Europe and in the United States, one of which is trash in the United States and in Canada. Which will come up in a moment. We take better care of our trash at festivals. But other than that, everyone's really having a good time. So in 2002 at Boom, I was there because I was kind of part of this nascent, then pretty underground psychedelic scene. And through that, I also knew a bunch of characters here in the San Francisco Bay Area who were kind of movers and shakers in the emerging kind of neotribal scene. You know, I'm not exactly sure when we could say the neotribal thing really began, where it began, you know, that, in a way that's, you know, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But in any case, it was certainly something that was coming to the fore in the Bay Area that I knew in the early 2000s. And so some of these folks were hanging around Boom in Portugal. But there was another crew that I got to meet there, which was a sort of similarly aligned group of folks from British Columbia and particularly from the Sunshine Coast. And these guys I just totally fell in love with. They were just like the most fun, creative, weird, elven, mystic, meta programming, goofball, psychedelic warrior, cool people that I had ever known. And so I just thought these guys were totally fun. And they thought I was an elder, which was funny because I was about 33 or something at the time. And so I became friends with them. And then I got to go up and the next few years spent a lot of time on the Sunshine Coast visiting, doing talks, going to some of their more local festivals, and really just soaking up their particular take on the neo-tribal scene, which was really esoteric and really forward-thinking. And one of the elements that made it really cool is that it combined some old classic kind of hippie memes, hanging out, nature spirits, plant medicines, healthy food, crunchy lifestyle, big heart, with a really forward focus on a kind of science fictional design element. So it was like not just ideas drawn from science fiction or futurism or things like that, but they were kind of implemented in the way in which people talked about things, the way in which they planned events, the way in which they created flyers. And indeed, one of the closest friendships I made at the time was with Sijay James, who's our guest today here on Expanding Mind. And he did the main guy who was doing flyers, design work, promotional materials, websites. And he brought up just a totally awesome, like kind of psychedelic science fictional vibe, but not in a 70s way. It was very much like current. It had this really great sense of a kind of organic emergence of a new way of thinking and doing. And a lot of it was super esoteric and like weird symbols and stuff drawn from Taoism. And he had a bunch of, co-creators who were helping it happen. It was very much a scene situation, even as there were many individuals who were shining in their own way. And it was really just a remarkable time at a very different sort of slice of psychedelic history. So at this late date, I thought I'd just, give CJ a call and talk to him for a number of years, occasional emails or since we last were hanging out a lot, and said, hey, let's come on the show and talk about stuff. So with no further ado, CJ, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Hey there, Erik. Great. Awesome to be considered for something like this.
Well, it's fun. One of the things I like to do is just, catch up with people. I mean, it's like this is sort of like, I don't do Facebook, so I don't have like a way of keeping like those sort of distant contacts as well, where you just hear little bits and blobs from people. And then after a while, I'm like, I could keep, every week I could interview someone who comes out with a new book. It's the most easy and in some ways the most boring thing to do. Oh, I get a new book. I read the book. I talk to the author about the book. And, it's great. That's a lot of what I do. I enjoy it. But it's also fun just to talk to people and particularly people that I had shared some great experiences with. And, and just as just a way to catch up. So
this is infinitely more cool than Facebook. Infinitely more cool.
Yeah. I never did that one, so I now I feel kind of good because I don't have to worry about it anymore. There's for a while I would tell people I wasn't on Facebook, like this was maybe, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, and people would get mad at me, like I was arguing with them. I wouldn't say anything. I go, "Are you on Facebook?" I go, "No, I'm not on Facebook," and they would be like, "Whoa, what's wrong with you? What do you do? Do you have some thing? You think I'm part of a conspiracy?" People were so sensitive about it. But
sorry.
No, go ahead.
When I think of Facebook, I think of it as being something that I was really interested in social media back in the time when we were hanging out. And I was a real proponent of this sort of futuristic culture that would connect through the internet and stuff like that. But Facebook ended up being so many of the things that I really didn't want to happen at all. It was like the nightmare realization of this thing that I campaigned heavily for. And because of my design life and the fact that I kind of became more of a promoter and more of a almost an advertiser, it's become this like necessary thing. Like I actually feel like I can't get off it, because if I get off it, my chunk of my work disappears. So I know it's a real thing for a lot of people. It totally makes sense. I don't have any judgment about it. It's just for whatever reason I was just too lazy to do it, and now there's a cleanness about the whole thing. But I'm sure I've suffered. I've missed events and things that I would totally have known otherwise. And, so everything's a mixed bag. But I think what's interesting to pull out of that is one of the things that made, and I want to talk more about specifically how you brought your technology skills, your design skills, your sense of what digital technology meant and could provide at this period of time, just around the turn of the millennium. It's like the first .com boom is kind of declined a little bit, but there was still the sense that like something big, big things were already happening, but something more was happening. And there was still that sense of I don't want to say utopian, because that's sort of a weird word, but like where it felt like that the technology was able to help design and support the flourishing of an alternative scene in a really interesting way. So I would just curious to hear how you brought your skills to bear. Did you meet people first? Was it a kind of organic process? And then how you brought particularly those design, technology, online skills into the work of supporting and
and helping a scene flourish.
Oh yeah, well for sure. I mean, so you remember that when you talk about the dot-com boom sort of going downhill at that time, but in Canada we were just like a little bit behind everything. So we sort of picked up this technological thing, this rave culture in particular. We picked it up later than what was going on in San Francisco and stuff. So, I mean, when it came around sort of Y2K time, and I mean, I had just sort of, I graduated from university and I was really into the whole thing as it was, as computers were blowing up and in the university context. And I was so enamored with it that I went into the computer lab. I didn't take computer studies. I was an English literature major. I ended up, with a degree in English literature. So I was kind of coming at it from the literature, the writing side of things. And I went into the computer lab there and I taught myself to use programs because I was really inspired to be part of this rave culture, which was unspeakably technological for me. And I really wasn't. I was more of a nature hippie, but the technological side of it just grabbed me, all of it. I mean, everything from the Technics 1200 turntables and this whole like form of music it was just speakers and electronics and wires, but somehow it had this connection to it that was really enticing to me. Rave culture just like grabbed people and it brought them all together. And I really wanted to find a way to be part of it. And I wasn't a DJ at the time. And I thought, it needs, I saw rave flyers were a thing, right? Like, I mean, I know they were down in the Bay Area too, but rave flyers were this really interesting dialogue. And that's how you found out about the events. And it was really underground. And I thought they were just so cool. And I figured out that the way that you learned to do that, the way that you did that was through Photoshop. I'd heard that someone say, "Oh yeah, you need to learn Photoshop." So I went to the Simon Fraser Computer Lab, which was pretty advanced at the time, and I taught myself to use all these programs, just to make rave flyers essentially. And then I made a zine. I started making zines for the scene, and it just kind of went from there. I met all of these people who became really important in that time. And two that I should mention right away is my friend Nasco, who was the one who ended up bringing us all to Boom, and my friend Delvin, who is just a mystic poet, gardener, technological guy. We were all really, at the time, we were all really connected by these ideas of what you might call, like ancient futurism or something like that. This timeless shamanic experience mixed in with a real futuristic feel. And I just kind of it all sort of spread from there, really. And we decided that rave culture was this perfect way to gather people in a sort of intentional community space. And we were really approaching it as university scholars more than partiers, for sure. We were really inspired by, say, Hakeem Bey's temporary autonomous zone writings, and definitely Terence McKenna's Archaic Revival was probably the most influential piece of work on us at the time. So we felt we were part of this emerging technological culture that was really rooted in a more ancient shamanic tradition.
Yeah, and just to cut in with some of my own reflections was just that, when you say all that, in a way, at this point of the game, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, ancient future, blah, 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 drugs, blah, blah, blah. And what's important to emphasize is just how proactive and intentional you guys were. I mean, the intentionality behind what's the language around a party? When do you have it? What calendar system are we working on? I mean, for example, I love the fact that at some point in the game, many people in your community just started to use the Jose Arguello's Dream Spell calendar as the calendar. So you would just, like when you're making agreements about when to do things, you would just be using this alternative system. And it just, it underscored for me the way that people in your scene were able to kind of use like design elements, systems thinking, different templates as a way of exploring collectively what it meant to be pushing on this strange, archaic future where there was a return to nature vibes and very grounded kind of hippie essence, and at the same time, moving on a light ship forward, into the future.
Yeah, we definitely mixed the two. That was such a huge component to it. Again, like the sort of plumbing the depths of more like archaic or ancient cultures. At the time, the Mayan culture was really looming large in the neotribal community. As you mentioned, Jose Arguelles' Dream Spell was sort of based on the Mayan calendar, but was sort of his own artistic interpretation of it. And we were really inspired by that, and found that when we adopted this system to a calendar, and the way that it worked was that the calendar was not just dates anymore. It had concepts behind each day, and tones and frequencies and all that kind of stuff. And it might seem a little woo nowadays. And I mean, Arguelles is not as widely accepted, but when our community adopted that kind of symbolic language and that relationship to time and everything, it had really extraordinary effects on the people. And what happened with us, like a certain type of synchronicity came into our lives that is undeniable. It's totally undeniable. And I wouldn't say that it proved that the calendar system was correct or whatever. I just thought of it as being a group of people who intentionally put themselves on a frequency, on a timing frequency that is connected to concepts, ended up experiencing a great deal of synchronicity around those concepts. So we decided that, instead of being connected to the Gregorian calendar, which, we sort of vilified as being the cause of all society's woes, and we put ourselves on the Mayan calendar, and suddenly, the connections that we were having were so much greater. It made it so that it was harder to figure out what days parties were going to be on, because it would be, red lunar moon or a red cosmic skywalker or whatever. But it had this significance that everybody embraced. It brought a real sort of magic to that time, and I kind of missed that a little bit. But it was, and it led to us, obviously, me in particular, because I was such an internet freak, that I just went looking for all the types of possibilities that I could for symbolic languages, and started just drawing connections through all of these things, whether it was future-oriented stuff or it was really past-oriented stuff. I ripped it from the internet and I put it on flyers, and I just made the things look really dense. Like, that was my style, was density of information on a flyer. So much so that I think people started to think that, we were just way too out there.
Yeah, well, that was part of the fun of it. I mean, as I said, like, it was like getting like these sort of esoteric, alchemical, but blueprints of some future that hadn't quite come together yet. And it really, for me, it was like the highest and most intense form of that much broader kind of neo-tribal vibe, which itself, I don't even really know where to talk about its origins. Like, was when you guys were coming up, when you were first sort of hanging out with Nasco and Delvin, and you were like running on these riffs and elves and Taoism and, all this kind of dream spell. Did you have a sense that there was already a lot of people or places that were already kind of doing this kind of thing? Or did it kind of emerge from what your interests were at that time?
For us, that culture always felt like we were what Delvin would describe as a cusp culture. And we were always talking about it in those terms. Like, it is emerging. It's new. It's something that hasn't been around before in the shape that it is, even though it's rooted in ancient futurism. So we really felt like we were this kind of vanguard, like rightly or wrongly, in a grandiose sort of way, like an evolutionary vanguard at the time. And keep in mind too that at the time there was a real sort of apocalyptic feeling to what was going on around things like Y2K, but also like the imminent 2012 stuff that we were all caught in. And because it was a little bit before real social media proliferation of these ideas, which totally shows you that like you're not in any way unique. We ended up just organically connecting with other communities that were sort of doing similar things. And obviously that's how we ended up meeting you, I would say that your book Technosis was one of, the important pieces in our library, just cluing us in that there were actually scholars who were looking at things like this. And then there was the Oracle gathering community in Seattle, which was really on an even more esoteric level than us, doing events close by. And obviously, like through rave culture, we ended up connecting with each other, And then there was the gathering of the tribes community down in LA. And those people were also in the same vein. And then there were some people in the Bay Area, people like Eve Lady Apples in particular, and Lindsay Lynx, and visionary artists like Carrie Thompson and Luke Brown and Zavi. Like those, we all met organically through events, but we formed a really tight bond with each other because we did feel like this neotribal thing. It was new and really exciting, and also we felt at the time, rightly or wrongly, that it was a real answer to some of the ills that we saw around us in mainstream culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those were all, I think that was really well said. And it's also interesting that all those scenes you talk about was all on the West Coast. And I say that not just because, obviously you got, it's where you were living. So you're going to be closer to a rave scene in Seattle or even LA than with people in the East Coast or whatever. But it's also, it also represents a certain kind of West Coast vibe.
Definitely.
Certain kind of resonance between, super hippie woo elements, but also technology, and also a kind of edge, a sense of edginess that's also kind of a feeling of return, like you're returning to some more ancient order or something. And those are all like really important memes that you can track throughout the West Coast. And when I've done my work on tracking festival culture, it's like it's very clear to me that there's something specific about what the West Coast puts into that mix. And in this case, its most visible outcome was, as you said, the careers of some visionary artists, and beyond even the careers of those artists, really a whole language. I mean, now if you go to festivals and you look at the art, you're like, okay, a lot of this stuff is pretty cliched, and it's cliched because they're still using the languages that were invented by a much smaller group of people 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And
Alex Gray, I would say, like, if you wanted to point to one real East Coast sort of connection, Alex Gray's influence on in quotation marks visionary art scene is still so prevalent, and he's still invited around to be part of these events now, even though they're more global. But Alex Gray's sort of ideas around art, and he's very prolific in his writing about it too, were very influential on our culture.
Absolutely.
Even the West Coast side of it too. And when you say West Coast, because we really identified with being West Coast too, that was like a big part of it too, was feeling different than the East Coast in some ways. Part of it was down tempo too. And if you look at the rave culture and the types of music that was part of it too, our communities really espoused this down tempo vibe. and it's still kind of there. It's still we were the people who sort of pioneered the chill room in quotation marks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was there was just sort of a kind of there was room made for the contemplative aspect of it. And then, of course, also the fashion side is that some of the people who were living in these worlds, moving in these worlds, were really, really creative dressers. I mean, it's part of the whole, festival Burning Man scene is just like being creative with your dress. Although, of course, there's also lots of imitation and plug and play kind of approaches. But there was something very unique. There's something unique and quite colorful about this. And in some sense, it's arguable that that's in a way like the most visible sign of a lot of this whole scene is what people call the feather and leather thing, a certain kind of like elven leather bound grungy. It's so hard to put your finger on it exactly, but it became, I think, one of the more visible elements. Probably ultimately it's unfortunate that the kind of more cognitive and spiritual memes didn't quite as translate as well. But that's sort of how things go. But in a way it made me think about, like, fashion's really interesting, because if it's just fashion, and other people disagree with me, but if it's just fashion, for me it's only so interesting. But when the fashion is also another way to kind of design an environment, then it's something very different, where the fashion is part of, along with the music, or along with the name of the gathering, along with the ritual behaviors, along with the language, all of those elements, they're all part of something where you're composing a kind of possible culture, like a culture that you could actually imagine, however fantastically, that would be able to live in a technological world while still keeping some kind of deep spiritual connection with nature and with very old ways of being in the cosmos and the cycles of time and the cycles of the seasons, and yet being open for the science fiction possibilities of the future. And like, what would that kind of culture really be? What would it look like? What would it feel like to be inside of that? And in a way, there's a kind of it's not like a utopia. It's more like it's almost like a simulation game. Like, you can get all these elements going, including the design elements, including the kinds of things that you were doing and Delvin were doing around language. And it kind of creates a sort of stage or a run through, a petri dish of some kind of possibility. So it makes sense that there was a sort of millennial feeling about it, that maybe you were really doing something very significant, even though it's harder to track from hindsight, really where did it go, or what actually happened with it.
I can see certain things that happened to it, and it's funny that you really focus in on the fashion, because I mean, one of the things that we always struggled with as a community was that we were broke. We're poor people in a way, and it was a real sort of dropout community. We didn't really want to be, we weren't adulting in quotation marks. We were really stepped out of the financial systems. And there was always a question of like, how can we sort of make some kind of money to make this stuff happen? And the fashion side of it became the strongest, export of our neotribal community. And unfortunately, as soon as there's actually, it's maybe not the strongest export, because eventually when electronic music really hit the mainstream, then the whole DJ thing exploded out of it. And that's ended up becoming the biggest business of it all. But for a long time, one of the ways of sustaining ourselves, sustaining this like neo-tribal thing, was the tribal market. And the tribal market was filled with this type of clothing. And it simultaneously it gave people an identity within, and it was like paradoxical, because it felt like you'd express your uniqueness through this dress, through this way of clothing yourself. But it also sort of became this almost cultish, exclusive, cliquey kind of thing that people backlashed against a little bit, because eventually it became commodified and it became the focus of the monetary side of the festival culture. And so you ended up seeing characters going off to Bali and taking their really sort of futuristic, but also sort of more ancient elvish designs, and getting like the Balinese craftspeople to craft all of this gear and bring it back, and it would be sold like at quite a quite upsold, a serious markup on it at festivals. And so you would see like a whole sort of class of people within the neotribal community that became like the richer part of it. I mean, there were obviously people, who delved a little bit in distributing the various different molecules that affected everyone's consciousness. And, there were those ballers, and then there were the people who made the clothing. And as the result of these things, as a result of these parts of the culture proliferating, I found myself that some of the other parts that we felt were the most important, people like Delvin and myself and Nasco, in our seeking to create an intelligence culture around it. We would create these places where people would come to learn and do workshops and things like that. And that part of the festival culture did, particularly in North America, mostly in North America, got shuffled away. And it became much more about the fashion and the tribal markets and the scene and everything like that. And that's sort of where we've left off in some ways. Although you mentioned the Boom Festival and Ozora and stuff like that, and those globally, the festival community still embraces that workshop, the learning part of it, let's try and make this culture sustainable in some way, rather than simply being another offset of entertainment culture and then consumerism and stuff. I really focus in on. If I was to get bitter about anything, I would be bitter a little bit about how much the fashion ended up taking over and becoming the thing that everyone deeply identified with. Although that's what happened. It was not my favorite part.
Yeah, no, it's a funny issue because it also has something to do with magic, like in the sense that on, as I said, like as part of a larger holistic scene or happening, putting on clothes that have their own flavors, their own allusions. They resemble things in the future. They resemble things in the past. There's this element of the archaic, but it's creative. In a way, it's an extension of some of the visual decisions you would make on your flyers. But there's a weird way in which, like, the magic, the glamour, literally, like the word glamour comes from like fairy lore. The fairy, right. The fairy folk will put a glamour on you, meaning that you're ensorcelled, you're in a spell, and that there is this power. And when you wear those kind of clothes and you're young and you're pretty and everything's happening and whatever, it's so juicy, it's so powerful that it becomes kind of intoxicating, and I think in some ways distorting if it becomes disconnected from these other, in a way, subtler or more not quite as obvious reasons to be drawing together. But rather than ragging on the ragging on fashion, I want to go back to what do you think was the most important stuff that you and Delvin and Nasco were thinking about, were memeing about? What was that element of intentionality that seems to you even now as being really valid, or something that you would have liked to see more of, that still has a resonance for you?
Well, definitely, Delvin was a real inspiration in that regard, and that he was perhaps, I would say, the most intentional of our crew in it. It was really important to him that everything that we did have some sort of. He always talked about the implications and the applications of this culture. And he kind of inspired us to keep being part of it. He sort of dropped away when it became more glam and everything because he felt less involved in it. But he was his real love was permaculture and gardening. And I think that that's still one of the most important things that we connected through. And it's like an unlikely thing to have really connected to rave culture. Surprisingly, all these techno hippies dancing around in the forest were also into sort of older but kind of revolutionary ways of gardening, of agriculture, sustaining ourselves. And that was really kind of where we came into things. I was much more the technological person. So for me, the important part of the things that we were on was about how we use technology and being conscious about how we interface with technology and sort of creating spaces within the emerging digital world for ourselves that are not controlled by the powers that be. And I wish that there was more of that. I called it digital ethics at the time, and in our workshops and stuff, I focused a lot in sort of talking to the techno hippies about being conscious of the world that they were creating in the digital space. Not that it seems to have done that much good in it, but that was one of the things that I felt was the most important of where I was at, and that coupled with the notion of being more sustainable. And permaculture is more than just gardening; it's sort of a way of. It's a sort of a holistic approach of looking at your life. You can look at your life as a garden and figuring out which things give you nutrients and which things take away from your nutrients, and how to live more in connection with nature and also, move forward. So I would say sort of like permaculture and digital ethics were probably the most important parts of it. And Delvin and I we crystallized it into a thing that we called the crystalline spore, which was our little workshop paradigm kind of thing that we were exploring at that time. And we would riff together on the nature and the technological side of things and how they weren't really that different. That nature was a form of technology, and technology has a natural flow to it. I think those are probably esoterically and ideologically are the things that I've held on to in it as I've moved through rave culture. And but I'm still really heavily involved in rave culture, but I'm more like the graphic designer promoting the events and everything now. You know what I mean? So I still enfold all that stuff. My flyers, and I still sort of pride myself on being able to embed all this kind of imagery and everything into it. And Delvin's a huge permaculturalist. He travels around the world to share this information with other people, though the rave culture is sadly not as embracing of, like I say, as we said, the more intelligent side of things. So we're less invited to speak to those things in North America, and it's a lot harder for us to get those transatlantic flights to go over there to places in Europe where they really do still embrace this kind of thing,
Yeah.
Still a big part.
So, and then since you're talking about kind of the stuff you've been working on now, I know you moved at some point from the Sunshine Coast to Nelson, a place I've never visited, but I've heard a lot about it from you and from Nasco and from others, which has its own kind of hippie countercultural past and is also a site for a lot of winter sports. So it has that weird like ski town kind of thing going on.
Oh yeah.
Give me a little slice of life in Nelson, man. How's this? Is capitalism destroying it like everything else?
It is. I have to be honest about that. It is. See, I left the Sunshine Coast because I needed a change, and there was a real sort of, there's a big festival up here called the Shambhala Music Festival, and it's a famous one in the world right now. It's kind of more bass music festival. And, I kind of followed my skill set out here in some ways because, there was a festival culture, but there's a town of 10,000 people, but it has like 4 nightclubs and 5 ski shops and everything. And I followed the snow because that was like an old school part of my life that I had let go because living on the coast, you can't really ski. And I'm a snowboarder, deep snowboarder from way back in like 1986 or something like that. And then I'd let it go during my hippie phase of things because, I felt that it was too connected to consumer culture and everything like that. And so I just didn't do it very much. But I came out here, and this is the epicenter of the best snow on the planet. You can see it because like it's in all the snowboard films. There's always people, skiing at our local ski area or going up into the mountains in helicopters and cats and everything like that. Like this is the best snow there is here. And for a long time, it was kind of a secret. And there were like these backcountry purists who lived up here, and there were hippie culture that was kind of built on pot growing kind of scene. So people had some money and they were able to buy their gear and everything like that, and take the whole winter off and just be up in the mountains. And it snows a lot, on the average. I mean, it was upwards of 15 centimeters. I don't know what exactly that is in inches, but I mean, 15 centimeters to 25 centimeters is not uncommon nightly. So we get the powder snow. We get the mystical feeling that people go for here. And so as the result of it, this town has become, it's been put on the radar. Snow sports are sort of exploding right now. And nowadays, I mean, this little town of 10,000 people has a similar real estate market to a place like Vancouver in terms of what houses are worth and the type of people that are coming out. So there was this weird counterculture that was here for a while, very hippie-ish, very, connected to psychedelics and pot, and even the rave culture to a certain extent. They can't really afford to be here anymore, because the housing market is filled with, expensive houses and Airbnbs because people want to come up here and ski. They want this very, affluent kind of lifestyle, this leisure culture lifestyle. It's kind of a paradox for me because I still am very much, a anti-corporate hippie, if you will, you know what I mean? But I love my gear. I love my snowboard, and I make it out to snowboard every morning if I can, from 9 o'clock in the morning until noon. I call it the businessman shred. When I get out there and I do the 3 hour. The hill is about 20 minutes from my place. I clock it at 21 minutes if there's not a stupid car in front of me that can't make it up the road. So I can make it up there in 20 minutes. I catch the first chair. I get the best snow in the world, completely untracked, very mystical, spiritual experience. And then I'm back in my office at noon, 12:30 or whatever, and I complete my work day, and it's sort of rinse and repeat. That's my life in the winter. I live for it. I love it. I'm a diehard snowboarder now. I went from not having done it for a few years to not really being able to imagine what my life would be like without it.
Well, yeah, and I'm curious about that. Like, especially as someone who, you had a lot of, wild experiences when you were younger at raves, dancing, collective energy, psychedelics, both in ritual forms and party forms and metamagical, elven science fictional forms. And, you've had a lot of rich experiences. And then now you're older. You're also like, it sounds even more deeply sort of not identified, but just you're deeply engaged with snowboarding, which, as you're not the only one who ascribes some of these spiritual, features to it. It's not just a sport. It's not just an exercise. It's not even just a way to get out, in beautiful nature. There's something about the flow. There's something about the connection with the speed and flow and matter that really brings it together for people like this, not dissimilar from surfing in that way, obviously.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
what is that? Like when how does that and how has that evolved for you like over the years? Like it's not like, oh, I've been there, done that, and I got to go on to another thrill. There's something that keeps compelling you that's not just repetition because that would get boring. There's something that's unfolding and evolving for you. And I just from that, almost from that more spiritual side, I'm just interested in hearing you about your evolved relationship with snowboarding.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So I was always really obsessed with water. It was something that I really identified with. Came as part of my Mayan sign too, the lunar moon, the universal water kind of thing. And I really identified with water and flow. And I considered water to be like the essence of flow. And in its liquid state, I mean, it just goes where it goes. You know what I mean? It flows. It is pure flow. And I remember the first winter that I came to Nelson after, having been psychedelic for many years. And I was just watching the snow fall. And it occurred to me, and it's not, I mean, it may sound like trite or whatever, but I was looking at frozen flow. I could see it just like gently falling down in the sky, and the flakes are this crystalline, just every one of them so like unique and yet you can see flow frozen in time. And then it's really complex actually, that it's not, it just gets you wet if it's rain. And I was just so sick of being in the rain culture. I mean, sure, you can identify with that. The San Francisco style winters can be, rainy, and that Sunshine Coast was far from sunshine in the winter. So, the snow really kind of inspired me. It just made flow so much more clear to me. And then the idea that when the board is on top of the snow, it's creating this friction that actually the water becomes flow again, and you're sliding and you're moving down, and everything is kind of like a play with gravity. It's a controlled falling, but the whole idea is to do it with style. And for some reason that it never gets old, because every run is totally different. Even if you go down the same run, it's always moving and changing. The snow conditions is no cliche that the Inuit in the north have all these names for snow, and it's not surprising to me. I have hundreds of names for snow myself, because the conditions are always so different. And then on top of that, there's this feeling that you get when you're on top of a mountain. And in some ways, skiing is sort of cheating it a little bit. And the purists, the real backcountry purists who hike up, they'll tell you that, earning your turns is the top, is the pinnacle of this type of experience. But when you're on top of a mountain, the inspiration that you get from being able to look out and have that much in your vision, it just like, it's awe-inspiring. It fills your heart, it fills your soul completely to just be able to see that much. And then, the trees that are just so, I mean, it's the sort of, Nelson is in a peculiar sort of place. It's sort of inland in BC, but it has a rainforest climate. So the trees are big. They're big trees here and everything. So you're in the middle of these big tree forests. It's silent as anything. It's about the silence of a winter forest is deep silence. You don't hear anything else but the swish of your board as you're going down, and the feeling of floating on top is unmatchable. You compare it only to sex, really, in terms of like how it feels. And it's also it's a dealing with yourself. Because it's you in the mountain, even if you're snowboarding with other people, you kind of lose that. You're not thinking about, necessarily what it looks like or what other people think about it. Everything drops away. That's why it makes my work so much easier when I go back to work, because I've utterly cleared my mind out. You can't really focus on anything else except getting down. And on a day when it snowed and there's a foot of fresh snow in front of you, there is just no feeling like that. It is as psychedelic as anything, because it's so beautiful and it's so pure, and you get to experience it. There's a book that I read a ways back. It's one of those sort of pseudo Buddhist books. It's called Surfing the Himalayas. I don't know if you heard about it, but
No.
It's one of those, popular fiction books that tries to explain Buddhism in the vernacular, tries to explain Buddhism in a way that anyone could get it, and it talks about Buddhism in snowboard terms. The rough plot is that a guy decides he's going to go surfing, or he's going to go snowboarding in the Himalayas. He's going to climb up one of the Himalayan mountains and snowboard down it. It's his idea. And as he snowboarding down, he just clocks a monk. He just hits a Tibetan monk. And it starts a series of dialogues between them in which the monk uses his snowboarding as a way to illustrate the principles of Buddhism. And it really influenced me, actually. I mean, I was already well familiar with Buddhism, but I just loved the way it connected with snowboarding. One of the things that stuck with me is a phrase, "be the board," and that is it's like my mantra every time I step in on the snowboard. Is that you become part of this thing that's just moving down. It's just moving. You're in complete connection with flow. So maybe I'm repeating myself, but really the real lesson in snowboarding for me, and the way it connects to my psychedelic past and whatever my future is just being in pure flow and becoming more proficient at working with that flow.
So here's a question for you. It seems it's always interesting and, to some degree disheartening and to some degree exciting when more and more people turn on to a sport, or particularly a sport that has this kind of inner side to it. And but it's almost like the same question of when you look back at the fashion question with the Sunshine Coast, there are aspects of practices that are easy to reproduce and to get obsessed with and to get your yayas through. And then there are subtler aspects that don't necessarily come along for the ride so easily. And that happens with these sports too, in the sense that it gets thoroughly professionalized, all the gear manufacturers, all the heroes, the professionals, the Olympics, Do you feel that people who are coming into it now, or the people you see, or the what's happening in the snowboard shops, and just your sense of the culture, is that inner side still available to people, or is it almost like getting lost in the visibility and the consumerism and the Olympics and Lanzo and all that kind of stuff? Or do you feel like there's a kind of inherent purity to the practice that is going to be communicating that at least to people who are ready for that or want to hear that?
Well, it's funny. It's funny that you mention it, because I'm a real snowboard media fanatic too. Like I really kind of crossed right over to it, and I like watching it as well. I'm really just inspired by the fluid aesthetics of it and everything like that. And I'm also a sucker for the capitalist side of it. I mean, I love my snowboard gear. I love the top sheets. I love how the gear kind of evolves as the years evolve. So there's that element of it, And I mean, I feel it's harder and harder to escape in the world. But my sort of anti-capitalist self has taken a pause, if you will, in certain levels of it, and I become inspired by those people who have made interesting businesses out of this type of culture. that, I mean, everybody's, I guess I kind of dropped the old idea that, being part of the counterculture meant that you dropped out completely, that this whole system was crumbling. I felt that originally, but now it's not, now it's kind of like clearly not crumbling. And one of the best things you can do is take part in it. So there's all sorts of like these younger people that are, and older people for that matter, in the snowboard world and in the ski world, who are using this platform to do interesting things, and to develop this take on it, to approach the spiritual side of things, to approach the purist side of it. And I mean, I can't name them in particular, but of course there's all these movies that come out. And one of the big snowboard stars, Travis Rice, he's done a lot for the sport in some ways. And one of his last films really addressed the concept of climate change and what that means to snowboarders, and and exploring sort of the change in the world's water supply, and how that changes snow and everything. So what I see is some of these, it's not all just consumerism now. It's people connecting in with this lifestyle. And I love that. I love that notion that, the lifestyle is the lifestyle is now so widespread that it's allowing these interesting folk to have a voice through it. There's that you can build a business that's successful, and the basis of that business can actually have a really cool message. Environmentalists really, you find a lot of environmentalist backcountry skiers here. We have a lot. We have some pristine land here that is always under threat from being logged, because that's what BC does. It just tears its forests down one way or the other. And so, the environmentalists kind of use their ski platform as a way to continue to bring the vision of the pure supernatural beauty of this place to the world. And I mean, that may be a small part of it, but the beauty of the world is something that inspires.
Yeah, that's good. That's well said. It almost sounds also like we just got actually we should wrap it up. I was going to introduce another idea, but it goes fast. See, it goes fast. I didn't feel like we even got to half the stuff, but thank you so much for sharing a slice of your life and catching me up on what you've been up to and going over some of the old tales. So thanks a lot, CJ.
Oh, Erik, I'm just so honored that you gave a call and allowed me to talk about some of this stuff, because I still feel like a lot of it's relevant, and you're one of my favorite people for sure. So definitely appreciate it.
Sweet. Well, I'll have to visit you one of these days, because it's now I want to really. I don't snowboard, but I can fake it.
Yo, you can fake it. Believe me, anyone can do it.
All right, man. All right. Until next week, folks. Keep your minds open.